Imagine you're a high-ranking aristocrat in 508 BC Athens. Your family name is legendary, your wealth is immense, and yet you've just lost everything. Your rival Isagoras has the backing of the Spartan war machine, and you're being shoved toward the city gates. Most men in your position would have fled or started a bloody traditional coup, but Cleisthenes did something that, to his peers, looked like a suicide mission. He turned to the crowd, the potters, the farmers, the unwashed, many who had never held a vote in their lives, and he didn't just ask for their help, he offered them the keys to the city. There's this incredible moment where the tension snaps. Isagoras is holed up on the Acropolis, protected by Spartan spears, feeling invincible. He expects the standard noble skirmish. Instead, he hears a sound he doesn't recognize. The collective roar of thousands of ordinary citizens who have suddenly realized they are the government. It wasn't a clean theoretical debate. It was a riot that turned into a revolution. What fascinates me isn't just that they won. It's the sheer cold logic Cleisthenes used afterward. He didn't just take over as the new boss. Instead, he meticulously dismantled the very power structures that allowed people like him to rule. He sliced the city into artificial tribes, forcing strangers from the coast to vote alongside mountain farmers, effectively breaking the old family mafias that had run Athens for centuries. It makes you wonder, was this a grand vision of human equality, or was it the ultimate, if I can't have the power, nobody can move? Either way, in that moment of aristocratic desperation, he stumbled upon a social experiment that would rewrite the next 2,000 years of history. This is the story of how Cleisthenes invented the demos.
And the transition taking place in that exact moment it's a profound architectural shift in human governance.
Right.
Because for centuries prior, the entire ancient Mediterranean world operated on this singular vertical axis. Power flowed downward, the bloodline of kings, the armed strength of tyrants, the immense land holdings of aristocratic clans.
That dictated literally every facet of civic life.
Exactly. But what Cleisthenes engineered in the aftermath of that riot was a society built on precautionary constitutionalism. It was not some natural, organic evolution of political goodwill. It was a deliberate, mathematically precise dismantling of traditional authority. He took the raw, unrefined energy of that crowd and channeled it into a highly structured, artificial system.
A system designed specifically to prevent any single individual or family from ever monopolizing the state again. So, you're stepping directly into the messy, physical, and frankly, highly engineered birth of popular power. But you cannot truly grasp the magnitude of Cleisthenes turning to the crowd without first understanding the vacuum of power that preceded him.
Yeah, you have to look at what exactly the Athenians were rebelling against.
Right, which requires stepping back to the middle of the 6th century BCE into the grip of the Pisistrated tyranny. Athens was entirely dominated by a man named Pisistratos.
And his initial ascent to power was just... well, it was an absolute masterpiece of calculated theatricality.
Oh, the chariot incident.
Yes. He drove his chariot into the Athenian agora, bleeding from a severe physical wound.
A very dramatic entrance.
He presented himself to the populace as the victim of a violent ambush by his political enemies. He claimed his life was in immediate danger because he was a champion of the common people.
But the reality was quite different.
The wound was entirely self-inflicted. Yeah, it was a psychological manipulation designed to bypass the existing legal structures. By presenting himself as a bleeding martyr, he successfully induced the Athenian assembly to vote him an armed bodyguard.
And armed with this state-sanctioned contingent of club bearers, Pisistratos immediately turned against the very people who granted him the protection.
Right. He marched up the Acropolis, seized the central stronghold of the city, and established himself as the absolute tyrant of Athens.
But once in power, he instituted a regime that operated as a sort of benevolent despotism. He made this highly calculated decision not to tear down the existing legal framework.
Decades earlier, a lawgiver named Solon had established a complex constitution. Pisistratos kept Solon's laws entirely intact.
Right. He didn't abolish the courts. He didn't eliminate the traditional political offices.
He simply ensured that his own family members and loyalists occupied all the critical positions within that framework. The adherence to the law was just a thin, functional veneer.
The true mechanism of his control was the systematic disarmament and geographical isolation of the Athenian populace.
Yeah, the disarmament story is chilling. He orchestrated an event where he called the armed citizenry to an assembly, but he spoke in a deliberately soft, low voice.
So they couldn't hear him from the back.
Exactly. To hear his words, the armed citizens were forced to crowd closely together, pressing inward toward the speaker's platform.
And while their attention is entirely focused on straining to hear him,
his henchmen moved quietly around the perimeter, confiscating the weapons the citizens had set down or were holding loosely.
He literally disarmed them while they were trying to listen to him.
It's brilliant and ruthless.
And once they were stripped of their physical power, he fundamentally changed their relationship with the state. He directed the citizens to leave the city center, return to their farms, and dedicate their entire existence to managing their private agricultural affairs.
He basically assured them that the complex, demanding affairs of the state would be handled entirely by him.
Right, and he provided them with agricultural loans, ensured a period of relative peace and prosperity.
Because the intention was to scatter the population in the countryside. He wanted to physically and psychologically remove them from the political center of Athens.
So Solon's laws remained written on the wooden blocks in the city, but their function as a check on executive power was entirely hollowed out.
The citizenry became passive. They were reduced to spectators of their own governance, trading their political agency for agricultural stability.
And this careful, disarmed equilibrium held for decades. But it completely shattered after Pisistratus died and his son, Hippias, inherited the tyranny.
The definitive turning point occurred in 514 BCE. During the Panathenaic festival.
Right, the assassination.
Yeah. Two men, Harmodius and Aristogaton, assassinated Hippias' brother, Hipparchus, and this single act of violence transformed Hippias' rule overnight.
The benevolent despotism evaporated.
Completely replaced by a ruthless, paranoid oppression. Hippias initiated a massive, violent crackdown.
Executing suspected opponents without trial, exiling prominent aristocratic families who posed any threat to his survival.
And among those forced into exile were Cleisthenes and his powerful extended family, the Alcmeonidae.
So from exile, these aristocratic factions recognized that they could not defeat Hippias internally. The Athenian population was disarmed and terrified.
So the exiled elites engineered a strategy to force a massive foreign military intervention.
And they had the money to do it. They utilized their immense wealth to reconstruct the temple at Delphi.
Right, and in doing so, they successfully bribed the priestess of the Delphic oracle.
Which is such a wild move.
And the bribery was highly specific. They instructed the oracle that whenever any Spartan officials arrived to inquire about state or religious matters, the priestess was to deliver one singular, repeated divine command.
That Sparta's divine duty was to liberate Athens from its tyrants. And the Spartans were a deeply pious, hyper-militarized society. The repeated divine mandate eventually broke through their political reluctance.
They complied with the oracle. They dispatched their king, Cleisthenes I, with a full Spartan army to cross the borders of Attica, invade Athens, and besiege Hippias on the Acropolis.
Which brings us to the pivotal year of 510 BCE. And the profound geopolitical shockwave this intervention created.
To really understand the reality of this moment, you have to observe the situation through the eyes of a Spartan hoplite. Let's call him Ariston.
Okay, picture Ariston. He's standing at the dusty perimeter of the Pelargicon Wall, the ancient fortifications surrounding the Acropolis.
Right. Ariston is a product of the Spartan machine. He's a man trained from childhood to obey a rigid dual monarchy and to maintain total control over a subjugated Helot population.
He is not in Athens out of a philosophical love for democratic liberty.
He is executing a calculated geopolitical maneuver to install a pro-Spartan aristocratic puppet government in Athens.
So Ariston watches as the tyrant Hippias, broken by the siege and the capture of his children, finally capitulates and flees into exile.
But as the gates open, Ariston feels a profound, cold dread.
Because the Athenian crowds surge forward.
Yeah, and they did not march with the disciplined, obedient silence of Sparta. They moved with this chaotic, roaring, unpredictable energy.
Men who had lived under the Pisistrated whip for decades, who had been ordered to keep their heads down and farm, were suddenly pouring into the civic center.
And they looked at the Spartan shields with a volatile mixture of gratitude for the liberation.
And a fierce, simmering defiance.
Exactly. Ariston realized, in that precise moment, that the Spartan military machine had inadvertently broken a dam they lacked the capacity to repair.
By removing the tyrant, they hadn't simply swapped one ruler for another.
They created an absolute power vacuum. And in doing so, they awakened a populace that suddenly realized the divine right of one man to rule was an illusion.
It's like the Spartan liberator felt the terror of a man who had intentionally set fire to his own house simply to kill a rat.
The geopolitical objective was achieved, but the socio-political consequence was monstrous to the Spartan mind.
Because the removal of Hippias instantly triggered a vicious, brutal power struggle between two of the elite Athenian rivals who returned from exile, Isagoras and Cleisthenes.
And they immediately resorted to the traditional aristocratic playbook, forming factions, rallying their wealthy clients.
But Isagoras recognized he was losing ground to Cleisthenes' superior political maneuvering, so he played the ultimate trump card.
He appealed directly to the Spartan king Cleomenes, inviting the foreign military back into Athens to crush his domestic rival.
Cleomenes returned with a smaller, specialized force.
Right, and his explicit intent was to dissolve the existing Athenian council and install a strict 300-man pro-Spartan oligarchy with Isagoras at its head.
And Cleisthenes, realizing the overwhelming military disadvantage, fled the city.
So the traditional aristocratic coup was executing perfectly according to plan. Isagoras was backed by foreign spears, the rival was gone, and the new government was declared.
But this is where the script flips violently.
Yes.
The ordinary people of Athens, the disarmed farmers, the potters, the laborers whose political consciousness had just been jolted awake, refused to submit.
When Cleomenes ordered the dissolution of the council members simply looked at the Spartan king and said no.
They openly defied the dissolution order.
This act of institutional defiance triggered a massive, violent, spontaneous uprising across the entire broader Athenian population.
They flooded the streets, grabbed whatever makeshift weapons they could find, and physically besieged Isagoras and the Spartan military force, driving them up onto the Acropolis.
The Spartans found themselves trapped in a foreign citadel, completely surrounded by a massive, enraged civilian population.
And after 2 days without adequate supplies, and facing the sheer numerical superiority of the unified Athenian populace, the highly trained Spartan warriors capitulated.
They negotiated a humiliating truce. They agreed to leave the city, completely abandoning their Athenian aristocratic allies.
Isagoras' supporters were either banished or executed, and Cleisthenes was immediately recalled from exile in absolute triumph. But let's stop right there, because if you look at the sequence of events, Cleisthenes didn't lead this riot. He was out of town.
He was literally in exile again.
Exactly. The population besieged the Spartans themselves, which forces a critical question about the traditional historical narrative we constantly hear. Was this truly a grand ideological revolution for democratic freedom? Or was it simply a desperate, localized population reacting violently to a foreign military occupation that accidentally left the door to absolute power wide open?
The physical reality of the events points entirely to the latter as the catalyst. I mean, the Athenian population was not standing outside the Acropolis debating abstract concepts of political philosophy or democratic theory.
Right, they weren't holding seminars.
They were violently rejecting a foreign-backed oligarchy. They were fighting against Spartan spears and the betrayal of Isagoras.
However, that desperate reaction is what forged the ultimate result.
Yes. Cleisthenes returned to Athens and witnessed the raw, unstoppable physical power of the mobilized crowd.
He experienced a stark, profound realization. The old game was completely dead. He knew he couldn't just step into the shoes of Pisistratos or Isagoras.
Because the people had just defeated the Spartan army. They would not simply go back to their farms and take orders from a new aristocrat.
Exactly.
So to rule this newly awakened populace, or more accurately, to ensure his aristocratic rivals could never harness this crowd against him, he had to entirely dismantle the old societal architecture.
He could not rely on the traditional structures of power because those structures were built to facilitate elite dominance.
So he engineered a completely new system designed to physically and mathematically prevent another tyrant or oligarchic faction from ever rising again.
Which brings us to the radical geometry of Cleisthenes' reforms. And to grasp how deeply this rewired the society, you have to look at the lived experience of the people forced through this machine.
Let's consider Elian, a charcoal burner who lived his entire life in the rugged, isolated hills of Parnes.
Okay, for generations, Elian's world was entirely vertical. It was defined by the local aristocratic lord of his valley.
Right. Elian's identity was his bloodline, his father's name, and his submission to his wealthy patron.
But when Cleisthenes redrew the map of Athens, Elian was abruptly informed that he was no longer just a man of the hills, obedient to the local lord.
He was now a member of a new, artificial tribe.
And this new tribe was not based on his family or his immediate neighbors. It legally mandated that Elian was now politically bound to wealthy sailors operating from the coastal ports and aristocratic merchants living in the urban center of the city.
Think about the day of the first tribal gathering.
Right, imagine it. Alien walks into a designated civic space, sits down on a stone bench, and his hands are permanently stained black with soot. He is gripped by a crushing sense of inadequacy.
Beside him sits a merchant smelling of expensive brine and imported perfumes.
And on his other side is an urban nobleman dressed in a fine linen chiton.
They are complete strangers, separated by vast gulfs of wealth, education, and geography.
Yet they are bound by a newly invented legal fiction that forces them to vote, fight, and govern as one single unit.
The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. Elian felt this severe vulnerability of losing his old, familiar world. The vertical structure of protection and obedience was gone.
And when it was his turn to speak, he was legally prohibited from introducing himself using his father's lineage. He was forced to speak his deme name.
The name of his specific village.
His voice cracks. It is a moment of profound disorientation. The old vertical world of above and below was being violently, forcibly flattened into a horizontal world of us.
The friction in that room was not the harmonious choir of enlightened citizens. It was the awkward, stumbling, tense speech of men forced to become neighbors by political decree.
This disorientation wasn't an accident. It was the entire point of the system. Cleisthenes systematically abolished the 4 traditional Ionian tribes.
Because those 4 tribes were ancient, strictly based on family relations, and they formed the absolute bedrock of upper-class Athenian political power.
The aristocratic mafias controlled their local tribes and therefore controlled the state. So Cleisthenes wiped them out of existence.
And in their place, he instituted 10 entirely new, mathematically artificial tribes.
This is where we see the sheer genius of his political engineering.
Yeah, he executed a massive mathematical reorganization of human geography. He looked at the entire territory of Attica and divided it into roughly 139 demes.
A deme was simply a local village, a rural parish, or a specific neighborhood within the city.
Exactly. The word demos literally translates to the villages or the people who inhabit them. To construct the 10 new tribes, Cleisthenes utilized a highly specific mechanism called the trides system.
Trides translating to thirds. Let's break down exactly how this reverse gerrymandering worked. How did he build these new tribes?
Well, he categorized all 139 demes into 3 distinct geographic regions. The first was the Astidae, representing the urban center of Athens and its immediate surroundings.
Okay.
The second was the Paradelia, representing the wealthy coastal regions and ports. And the third was the Mesogea, representing the inland hills and agricultural farming territories.
So city, coast, and inland.
Right. And to build just one of the 10 new tribes, Cleisthenes took 1 trides, 1 block of demes from the city center, 1 trides from the coast, and 1 trides from the inland hills.
He bound these 3 entirely disconnected geographic blocks together and declared them a single tribe. If a wealthy coastal aristocrat previously controlled the political votes of everyone in his coastal region through bribery or intimidation, that power was instantly neutralized.
Because now, his coastal region only makes up 1/3 of a new tribe.
Right. To get anything passed, he has to convince the urban craftsmen and the inland charcoal burners who owe him nothing and live days away from his sphere of influence.
It physically shattered the localized lobbying power of the ancient family networks. It forced individuals from entirely different economic background and geographic interests into the exact same political unit.
But Cleisthenes knew that just drawing lines on a map wasn't enough. He had to rewrite their fundamental psychology.
He initiated a massive social engineering project regarding citizen identity.
He legally abolished the use of patronymics in civic life. You could no longer identify yourself by your father's name.
And in the ancient world, your father's name was everything. It signaled your noble lineage, your wealth, your ancient clan.
Cleisthenes replaced it entirely with demonymics. You had to identify yourself by the name of your deme, your village.
Even the most elite ancient families, men who traced their bloodlines back to gods, were legally forced to identify themselves by their civic location.
You weren't Platon, son of Ariston anymore. You were officially Platon of Kalaitos.
And to cement this artificial structure, Cleisthenes recognized the human need for shared mythology. He assigned new, localized heroes to each of the 10 tribes.
Securing religious sanction for these heroes from the Delphic oracle.
Yeah, he deeply embedded these artificial tribes into the religious fabric of the society. Crucially, one of the 10 tribes was named after the Homeric hero Aias.
Aias wasn't a native Athenian.
Right, he was a foreigner from Salamis. By elevating a foreigner to the status of a foundational tribal hero, Cleisthenes symbolically validated the integration of naturalized citizens and outsiders into the newly forged civic structure.
He severed the ancient loyalties completely. The traditional elites could no longer rely on localized blocks of rural dependents to secure dominance.
Because those dependents were now distributed across different tribes, voting alongside urban craftsmen and coastal traders.
And this forced integration created an unprecedented level of civic capacity. The daily acts required to run the system voting on local matters, mustering for military service within your tribal regiment, and managing the financial logistics of the demes taught the broader population the basic arithmetic and mechanics of self-governance.
The artificial tribe became the fundamental operational unit of the state. It required constant daily interaction and compromise among citizens who, under the old system, would never have crossed paths.
This forced interaction built the horizontal networks necessary to sustain a functional, complex state apparatus. But drawing a new map and forcing people to meet in local councils doesn't run an empire.
No, it doesn't.
With the population rewired into these new horizontal networks, they required a central engine to actually run the daily, grueling administrative affairs of the state.
Because the assembly of all citizens couldn't meet every day to handle grain shipments or foreign diplomats.
Actually, this necessity led directly to the creation of the boule, the Council of 500. And the sheer weight of this new responsibility fell squarely on the shoulders of ordinary, uneducated citizens.
To grasp the reality of the Council of 500, we must look at the experience of someone like Theron.
Theron is a humble olive farmer.
He possesses no formal education in statecraft. He had never traveled further than a single day's walk from his olive grove.
Yet, on a designated day, Theron stood in the Civic Center and watched his name drawn by a highly engineered allotment machine called the kleroterion.
And we really need to explain the physical mechanics of this machine, because it's vital to understanding how obsessed they were with eliminating bias.
This wasn't just pulling a name out of a hat.
No, the kleroterion was a massive slab of stone. Carved into the face of this stone were dozens of vertical slots, organized into columns.
And every citizen eligible to serve had a small wooden or bronze ticket, a panakion, with his name carved into it.
Theron would insert his panakion into one of the slots in the stone. Attached to the side of the stone slab was a long vertical bronze tube with a funnel at the top.
Right.
An official would pour a mixture of black and white dice into the funnel. The dice would drop down the tube and emerge one by one at the bottom.
And the color of the die determined your fate.
Exactly. If a white die emerged, the men whose tickets were in the corresponding horizontal row on the stone were instantly selected for the council.
And if a black die emerged, that row was dismissed.
It was a completely randomized physical mechanism that was impossible to rig, bribe, or manipulate.
So Theron watches a white die drop, and suddenly he is no longer a spectator of history. He is a governor.
He walks into the council chamber, and the sensory reality hits him.
The air is thick with the smell of unwashed wool, sweat, and the frantic, chaotic energy of 500 men trying to manage the logistics of a massive city-state.
Theron feels a paralyzing shame when he is handed a scroll and tasked with drafting a report on the grain supply.
Because he is a man of the earth. He knows the soil, not rhetoric or administration.
He looks at the empty seats of the aristocrats who used to run things, and he realizes that this entire system is a fragile, terrifying gamble on the average man.
He is forced to stay up late by the light of a flickering oil lamp, his rough, calloused fingers cramping as he traces the letters, trying to make sense of administrative ledgers and grain shipments.
And his overriding fear is not the wrath of a distant king. His fear is failing his peers.
He is terrified of the 499 other ordinary men in that room who will immediately recognize if he is incompetent.
This is the birth of the representative soul. It's the bone-deep realization that the state is not a distant, infallible god.
The state is a clumsy, demanding, physical machine that requires his specific, fallible hands to keep it turning.
When Theron steps up to the podium, trembling, terrified, but refusing to walk away, you are seeing the absolute majesty of the Council of 500.
The use of the kleroterion represents a radical, fundamental departure from almost all modern conceptions of representative government.
Entirely. When we look at comparative analysis of ancient Athenian democratic institutions alongside modern representative governance systems, a stark philosophical divide emerges.
Modern systems equate democracy with elections, but the Athenians equated elections with oligarchy.
Wait, you were telling me they view the act of voting for a leader as an aristocratic concept.
The fundamental Athenian political philosophy maintained that elections inevitably, structurally favor the elite.
If you hold an election, the populace will naturally gravitate toward the wealthiest candidate, the most famous candidate, the most rhetorically skilled, or the most highly educated.
Elections filter for distinction, and distinction is inherently aristocratic.
Sortition, the process of selection by pure random lottery, was viewed as the only mechanism that guaranteed true mathematical political equality.
Because the lottery doesn't care if you're a billionaire merchant or a soot-stained charcoal burner.
Sortition ensured that the Council of 500 was a perfect descriptive microcosm of the entire citizen body.
50 men were drawn randomly from each of the 10 artificial tribes. The council was a demographic mirror of Athens.
But the rotation of power within this system was relentless. The 50 men from a single tribe served as the executive steering committee, known as a patronymics, for 1/10 of the year.
They lived in a specialized building, fed at public expense, on call 24/7.
And within that committee of 50, they pushed the rotation even further. Every single day, a new president, an epistates, was chosen by lot.
For a 24-hour period, a randomly selected citizen held the actual keys to the city's treasury. He held the physical state seal.
He acted as the absolute head of state for all official communications with foreign ambassadors.
The primary power of this entire Council of 500 was agenda setting. They didn't pass the final laws, but they were responsible for preparing the probulumata,
The formal resolutions and decrees that would be brought before the massive assembly of all citizens for debate and voting.
because the assembly, consisting of thousands of men, could not vote on any matter that had not first been processed, drafted, and formally proposed by the Council of 500.
This controlled the flow of information. It prevented the massive assembly from devolving into total legislative chaos. The council shaped the questions that the people would answer.
I have to stop you here, though. Look at this structure. Does not sortition practically guarantee catastrophic incompetence? You have a massive, complex city-state dealing with grain shortages, naval fleets, and foreign empires. And its executive committee is composed of amateur charcoal burners and olive farmers, rotated daily, drawn from a literal stone lottery machine.
There is no specialized expertise at the highest levels of executive function.
It appears to be a guaranteed recipe for administrative collapse.
The Athenians deeply anticipated this exact vulnerability. They were not naive about human nature or the lack of specialized knowledge among the peasantry.
Because the system was run by amateurs, and because the massive assembly held ultimate power, the entire state was highly susceptible to manipulation.
Charismatic demagogues, skilled orators, and ambitious elites could easily sway the passions of a crowd that lacked deep policy expertise.
To survive its own structure, the democracy required extreme, almost paranoid defense mechanisms.
This brings us back to the concept of precautionary constitutionalism. They understood that ordinary citizens possessed the collective intelligence to judge proposals.
But they recognized the lethal danger of any single individual accumulating too much psychological or political influence over the crowd.
The most famous, and perhaps the most physically dramatic of these defensive mechanisms, was the institution of ostracism.
Once a year, the assembly held a preliminary vote simply to determine if an ostracism was necessary that year.
And if the crowd approved it, a highly orchestrated physical process was set into motion.
Picture the absolute physical reality of this. Thousands of citizens descend on the agora, the central marketplace.
The vast open space is temporarily fenced off with wooden barriers, creating 10 specific tribal entrances.
Every citizen walking through those entrances brings with them a shard of broken pottery, an ostracon.
Because paper did not exist in this context and papyrus was expensive.
Broken pottery was the refuse of the ancient world. It was completely free and abundant.
Before arriving, or while standing in the dirt of the agora, the citizen would take a nail or a sharp stone and scratch the name of a specific prominent politician into the surface of the pottery shard.
They drop the shards into urns. The officials count them. A minimum quorum of 6,000 cast shards was required for the vote to be valid.
The man whose name appeared most frequently on those broken pieces of pottery was given 10 days to pack his affairs.
He was legally exiled from the city of Athens and the entire territory of Attica for exactly 10 years.
But it is vital to clarify that ostracism was not a criminal punishment.
Right. There was no trial, no presentation of evidence, and no defense speech.
The exiled individual was not stripped of his property. His wealth, his estates, and his assets remained completely intact and protected by the state.
Furthermore, his citizenship was fully restored the moment the 10-year period expired.
It was purely a political safety valve. It was a blunt, physical mechanism designed to forcibly remove any individual whose prominence, wealth, or charismatic influence threatened to overwhelm the mathematical equality of the system.
If you were too popular, too successful, or too persuasive, the state viewed you as a structural threat to the democracy itself, and you were expelled.
And the architecture of ostracism reveals a profound historical irony regarding Cleisthenes, the architect of the system.
His own maternal grandfather was Cleisthenes of Sicyon, a man who ruled his city-state as an absolute tyrant.
Cleisthenes of Athens, possessing immense aristocratic wealth, the prestige of his family name, and the overwhelming popular support of the uprising that drove out the Spartans.
He possessed all the necessary components to consolidate power. He could easily have attempted to establish himself as the new Pisistratos.
Instead, he engineered a system designed explicitly to expel potential tyrants.
By instituting ostracism, Cleisthenes built a mechanism that protected the city from the ambitions of its elite class, up to and including his own potential future ambitions.
He built a machine that could exile its own creator.
As the democracy matured, the Athenians realized that exiling individuals wasn't enough. They had to control the impulsive nature of the legislation itself.
A later addition to this precautionary framework was the graph patronymic. This translates to an indictment for illegal proposals.
It functioned as a system of judicial review.
Right. Any citizen sitting in the assembly who heard a newly proposed decree and believed it contradicted existing constitutional law could stand up and invoke the graph patronymic.
The moment it was invoked, the implementation of that new decree was immediately suspended.
The entire matter was physically removed from the chaotic, passionate environment of the assembly and transferred to a randomly selected citizen jury.
Usually consisting of men over the age of 30 who had sworn a specific judicial oath.
This mechanism was designed to force a pause. It deliberately cooled the sudden, volatile passions of the assembly,
providing a sober, legally focused second look at laws passed in the heat of the moment, often under the intense, manipulative influence of demagogues.
If the jury found the decree unconstitutional, the law was struck down, and the politician who proposed it was heavily fined.
But no system is completely immune to the passions of the crowd. The ultimate catastrophic failure of these precautionary measures occurred in 406 BCE.
During the horrific Arginusae affair.
This event violently exposed the deep fragility of popular sovereignty.
Athens had just won a massive, desperate naval victory at Arginusae.
However, immediately following the battle, a severe storm swept across the Aegean.
The turbulent waters and high winds prevented the victorious Athenian generals from executing standard procedures to rescue the thousands of shipwrecked Athenian sailors clinging to the wreckage.
Thousands of citizens drowned.
When the news reached Athens, the grief of the city instantly mutated into absolute blind rage.
The assembly gathered, whipped into an emotional frenzy by the grieving families and opportunistic demagogues.
A politician named Cleisthenes stood before the crowd and introduced a motion to try and condemn all 8 generals collectively in a single mass vote.
This proposal was a direct, blatant violation of core Athenian constitutional law.
The law explicitly required that every individual face a separate individual trial,
ensuring they had the right to present a specific defense regarding their personal actions during the storm.
A citizen named Euryptolemos recognized the illegality of the motion. He stood up in the roaring assembly and utilized the graph patronymic to challenge Cleisthenes' illegal decree.
He attempted to pull the emergency brake on the machine.
The response of the crowd was absolute, terrifying hostility. They did not pause.
They turned their rage entirely on Euryptolemos. The mob began shouting, browbeating him, screaming that it was a monstrous outrage if the sovereign people were not allowed to do whatever they wished, whenever they wished.
The demagogues explicitly threatened to add Euryptolemos' name to the execution list alongside the generals if he did not withdraw his constitutional challenge.
Under the threat of immediate physical violence from his own peers, Euryptolemos dropped the challenge.
The constitutional safeguard completely collapsed. The mass trial proceeded.
The generals were condemned in a single vote, and the men who had just saved Athens from naval defeat were executed.
The contradiction exposed here is stark and undeniable.
The exact same precautionary measures designed meticulously to protect popular sovereignty from elite manipulation proved utterly powerless when the sovereign people consciously, violently decided to ignore their own rules.
The system was designed to protect the people from tyrants, but it possessed no mechanism to protect the people from themselves.
Despite these horrific failures, when the system was pushed to its absolute psychological limits, the daily grinding operation of this radical democracy unlocked a level of collective power and efficiency that deeply terrified and horrified Athens' aristocratic neighbors.
Because the core of this power, the actual engine of their dominance, was not simply the right to cast a vote. It was the principle of Isagoria.
Isagoria translates roughly to the equal right of public speech.
It was the constitutionally protected right of any citizen, regardless of wealth or lineage, to stand before the assembly, debate policy, and contribute specific information.
This is a profound distinction. Merely casting a vote is a passive expression of preference.
Isagoria is the active contribution of knowledge.
While a single vote carries limited mathematical weight, a single piece of specific, localized knowledge presented during a massive debate has the potential to alter the entire trajectory of state policy.
Imagine a debate about deploying a naval fleet to a specific island. The aristocrats might argue grand strategy.
But a humble merchant sailor who has actually navigated those specific coastal shoals can stand up, utilize his Isagoria, and inform the entire assembly about hidden reefs or local wind patterns.
By harnessing the diffuse, localized intelligence of 30,000 citizens drawn from every economic sector in every geographic region of Attica, the democratic state produced decisions that were, on aggregate, consistently superior to those made by isolated, insulated oligarchies operating in neighboring states.
The collective cognitive capacity of the integrated demes outmatched the specialized but narrow knowledge of the elites.
The immediate material result of this unified civic intelligence was the creation of a terrifying new model army.
Cleisthenes reorganized the military directly along the lines of the 10 new artificial tribes. Each tribe was responsible for supplying a regiment of 1,000 hoplite soldiers.
These regiments were led by 10 strategoi, or generals, one elected from each tribe.
The effectiveness of the structural reorganization was tested almost immediately in the fires of a massive two-front invasion.
In 506 BCE, just a few short years after Cleisthenes' reforms, the armies of the Boeotians invaded from the north, and the armies of the Chalcidians invaded simultaneously from the east.
The newly enfranchised Athenian population mobilized their tribal regiments, marched out, and achieved something militarily astonishing.
They defeated the Boeotians in a massive clash, immediately pivoted their forces, marched against the Chalcidians, and utterly destroyed their army on the exact same day.
The ancient historian Herodotus observed this unprecedented martial vigor and concluded that it was directly tied to their new political structure.
He observed that while the Athenians were ruled by the pisistrated tyrants, they were ordinary, unremarkable fighters. They were deliberately slack in battle because they were working for a master.
The victory belonged to the tyrant, not the soldier. But the moment they were enfranchised with equal speech and absolute political power over their own state, they became infinitely more lethal.
They fought with a terrifying ferocity because they were no longer fighting for a king.
They were fighting for themselves, their specific demes, and their own sovereign power.
This intense, newly forged civic pride manifested in dramatic cultural elevation across the entire society.
The archaeological record demonstrates an immediate explosion of massive public building projects initiated not by a wealthy patron, but by the democratic state itself.
But the most intimate evidence of this shift is found in the dirt, in the data regarding adult burial rituals.
Prior to the democratic reforms, the formal, elaborate burial of an adult was a rare privilege of the extreme elite.
The recovered records show formal adult burials occurring at a rate of roughly 1 per year. Following Cleisthenes' reforms, this rate violently skyrocketed.
It jumped to 9 formal adult burials per year.
This sharp increase does not reflect a sudden, massive influx of population or a horrific plague. It reflects a profound, deep psychological shift in the populace.
The ordinary population suddenly viewed its own lives, the lives of humble craftsmen and farmers, as dignified, elevated, and worthy of formal, permanent remembrance.
The citizen felt a sense of intrinsic worth that had previously been reserved exclusively for kings.
Yet the intense early years of this democratic fervor were also marked by significant, nearly catastrophic geopolitical miscalculations. The people were learning how to run a foreign policy in real time.
In 507 BCE, directly following the expulsion of Isagoras and the Spartans, the Athenian assembly anticipated a massive retaliatory invasion by King Cleisthenes.
Acting out of pure desperation, democratic Athens sent an embassy across the sea to Sardis, seeking a protective military alliance with Aristophanes, the powerful satrap of the Persian Empire.
Aristophanes looked at these relatively unknown Greek ambassadors and demanded the traditional, non-negotiable token of Persian submission: earth and water.
To the Persians, this was an absolute surrender of sovereignty.
The Athenian ambassadors, operating far from home and acting on their own desperate initiative to secure protection, agreed.
They offered the earth and water, formally submitting the city of Athens to the Persian king.
When the ambassadors finally returned to Athens and reported what they had done to secure the alliance, the Democratic Assembly exploded in fury.
They fiercely repudiated the ambassadors' actions, formally censured them, and violently rejected the submission to Persia.
They refused to trade their newly won local sovereignty for imperial protection.
However, in the strict administrative eyes of the massive Persian Empire, the internal politics of the Athenian assembly were irrelevant.
Athens had solemnly sworn submission via their official representatives, and by repudiating it, they had subsequently rebelled.
This fundamental diplomatic misunderstanding, born from the chaotic early days of democratic diplomacy, permanently set the geopolitical stage for the massive existential conflicts of the impending Persian Wars.
When you look back at the sheer scale of Cleisthenes' achievement, it rests entirely in its mechanical genius.
The Athenian model he engineered was not a naive philosophical utopia built on an optimistic belief in the inherent goodness of humanity.
It was exactly the opposite. It was a highly engineered, deeply suspicious machine built on profound cynicism about human nature.
It utilized artificial geography to break local mafias.
It relied on strict mathematics to enforce representation.
It deployed random stone lotteries to violently sever ancient loyalties and actively prevent the hoarding of power by anyone, elite or otherwise.
The system operated on the assumption that anyone who gained power would eventually abuse it, and therefore the system itself had to constantly rotate, diffuse, and threaten that power.
The historical irony of the system is absolute. This rigorously decentralized system, built obsessively to prevent a single tyrant from ever ruling at home, unlocked such unprecedented military and economic vigor that it turned the entire city of Athens into a collective tyrant abroad. The democracy forged in the fires of a riot to ensure local equality ultimately allowed a mobilized population of ordinary citizens to build, manage, and ruthlessly dominate a vast Asian empire.